Title: The Mimic of Blackwood Ridge. The Appalachian Mountains are not merely land, they are a sprawling, ancient consciousness that predates human memory. In the hollows of Blackwood Ridge, silence is not the absence of sound. It is a heavy, suffocating presence that watches you. I have lived in this cabin for 15 years, and I know the forest's language. I know the chatter of the gray squirrels, the frantic call of a blue jay, and the deep, territorial grunt of a black bear. But tonight the forest is speaking in a language that doesn't belong to this earth. It began at 1:17 a.m. The wind had died down completely, leaving the air stagnant and cold. I was sitting by the hearth, reading, when the first sound broke the stillness. It was not a roar or a growl. It was a rhythmic, calculated scratching against the northern wall of the cabin. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It was a metallic, grating sound, as if long, jagged talons were dragging across the hand-hewn logs. My blood turned to ice. I reached for the shotgun on the mantel, my hands trembling with a primal, uncontrollable fear. I have heard stories of the Yenald Lushi, the skinwalker, from the elders in the valley. They spoke of creatures that wore the skins of wolves, coyotes, or men to hide their true malevolent nature. They said that if you hear a sound you recognize, a voice you know, you must never, under any circumstances, open the door. I sat in the darkness, the firelight casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. The scratching moved. It traveled along the side of the cabin, slow and deliberate, until it reached the porch. Then, silence fell. It was a silence so profound that I could hear the frantic pounding of my own heart in my ears. I stood paralyzed, eyes fixed on the heavy oak door. Then the voice came. It was my brother Elias, who had died in a logging accident 5 years ago. "Open up, Tom," the voice pleaded, perfectly mimicking his cadence, his warmth, and his signature laugh. "It's freezing out here. My truck broke down on the old logging road. Please let me in." My brother's voice was unmistakable. It contained the same minor rasp he had acquired after a bout of pneumonia in his youth. My hand moved toward the latch, an instinctual, grief-stricken reflex, before I slammed it back onto the shotgun. Elias was dead. I had buried him myself. The entity outside wasn't just mimicking him. It was peeling back the layers of my memory, searching for the key to unlock the door. The thing outside hissed, a sound like dry leaves skittering over a tombstone, and then it began to speak again, this time in a chorus of voices. My mother, my high school sweetheart, my father, all of them dead, all of them pleading for entry. I slumped against the wall, the gun gripped white-knuckled in my hands. The cabin, once my sanctuary, had become a wooden box in the middle of a hungry forest. I peered through the narrow slit of the window, but the moonlight failed to penetrate the thick, swirling fog. Something was out there. Something that didn't just walk the woods. It walked the architecture of my past. It knew exactly who I was, and it was waiting for me to surrender to the comfort of a lie. The air inside the room grew frigid, and I could see my own breath puffing in the dim light. I realized then that the skinwalker wasn't just trying to get in. It was testing the strength of my sanity. It was playing with its prey, teasing me with the echoes of a life I had long since laid to rest. I checked the bolts on the window. They were secure, but for how long? The forest floor groaned under the weight of something heavy, something that moved with an unnatural halting gait. It was circling the house, mapping my vulnerabilities, searching for a gap in my resolve. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the voices of the dead, but they grew louder, more insistent, their tone shifting from sorrow to a cold, biting hunger. I am the only thing standing between this cabin and a nightmare that defies the laws of nature. The voices finally faded into a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from the very floorboards of the cabin. I did not move. I did not blink. I remained a statue in the center of the room, my shotgun leveled at the door. I knew that the skinwalker relied on the power of the observer. If I acknowledged its presence, if I gave it the validation of my fear, it would grow stronger. My mind raced through every survival trick I had ever learned, but none applied to an entity that could synthesize the dead. Hours bled into one another, the moonlight shifting across the floor like a pale spectral hand. The creature began to change its tactics. Instead of mimicking voices, it began to change its size. I could hear its massive frame scraping against the eaves, the wood of the roof bowing under a weight that seemed to defy the physics of a coyote or a wolf. It sounded like a bear, then like a man walking on stilts, then like something fluid sliding over the shingles like oil. It was testing the cabin's integrity, checking for a weak joist or a loose shingle. I looked up at the ceiling, expecting to see the wood splinter at any moment. Then the cabin went quiet again. The suddenness of it was worse than the noise. I crawled toward the hearth and added a fresh log to the fire, the sparks flying upward like tiny dying stars. As the flames licked the wood, I saw a shadow fall across the floor beneath the door. It wasn't the shadow of a man or a beast. It was something distorted, elongated, with far too many joints. It reached toward the gap between the door and the floor, a long, translucent digit probing for the latch. I didn't hesitate. I kicked the base of the door, and a guttural, inhuman screech tore through the night. It wasn't a cry of pain. It was a cry of frustration, a sound of ancient, boiling rage. I backed away, my heart hammering. The creature knew I was awake. It knew I was armed, but it also knew that I was trapped. I looked at the wall again, and I saw a singular yellow eye peering through a knot in the wood. It was not a wolf's eye, nor a human's. It was a swirling vortex of amber and sulfur containing the history of 1,000 deaths. It blinked, and for a fleeting second the entire room seemed to rotate. I felt a wave of nausea, a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if I were being pulled into the creature's gaze. I turned my head, forcing myself to look at the fire. "I know what you are," I shouted, my voice cracking in the silence. "You have no power here." The forest answered with a cacophony of distorted bird calls, crows sounding like weeping infants, owls mimicking the screams of a woman in labor. It was a mockery of life, a digital-like distortion of the natural order. The creature began to pace, its steps heavy and synchronized, circling the cabin like a shark in dark water. I realized that the skinwalker was not just a creature. It was a parasite. It lived on the energy of the living, on the terror of the witness. It was feeding on the sweat of my fear, growing stronger with every passing minute of my panic. I took a deep breath, trying to slow my heart. If it fed on fear, then I would give it nothing. I sat on the floor, cross-legged, and began to recount the names of every mountain in the range, a mantra of reality to ground me. The creature stopped its circling. It pressed its face against the window, the glass bowing under the pressure. I did not look. I did not acknowledge it. I focused on the cold stone of the floor, the smell of the pine smoke, and the hum of the embers. The entity outside began to groan, a low tectonic rumble that shook the foundations of the cabin. It was trying to rattle my composure, to find a fracture in my resolve. But I held fast. I was the master of this space, and I would not be the next skin on its trophy wall. As the sky began to bleed into the dull gray of pre-dawn, the entity made its final move. The voices returned, but they were no longer the voices of my loved ones. They were the voices of everyone I had ever known, all speaking in unison, a discordant, multi-tonal wall of sound that threatened to shatter my eardrums. "We are hungry," the chorus droned, "and the woods are never full." The front door began to bend inward, the heavy oak frame splintering with a sound like a gunshot. The creature was no longer playing games. It was forcing its way into reality, a physical manifestation of the impossible. I raised the shotgun, my aim steady, my mind clear. The door buckled, the metal hinges screaming in protest before flying across the room. A whirlwind of dead, matted fur, exposed muscle, and yellowed bone lunged into the cabin. It was a nightmare of taxidermy. The head of a mangy coyote fused onto the torso of an emaciated man, with limbs that hung at impossible, broken angles. It didn't walk. It shuddered into the room, its presence turning the air to liquid ice. I pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the confined space, the buckshot tearing through the creature's chest in a shower of black, viscous bile. It collapsed, but the wound began to knit itself back together with a sickening wet sound, the bones clicking and sliding back into place like a shifting puzzle. It let out a laugh, my laugh. It was using my own voice, my own cadence, my own arrogance. It stood up, its elongated frame scraping the ceiling beams. I grabbed the kerosene lamp from the table and hurled it at the entity's feet. The oil splashed across its fur, and in an instant, the cabin was a furnace. "Fire is the only thing that can kill a shadow," the elders had said. The creature ignited, its skin burning with a bright, unnatural blue flame. It didn't scream. It began to dissipate, its form unraveling into a mass of oily smoke and swirling cinders. The heat was unbearable, but I scrambled toward the back window, dragging myself through the broken glass as the ceiling began to collapse. I collapsed onto the cool, damp earth of the forest floor, watching as my cabin, my only protection, was consumed by the fire. The blue flames climbed high into the trees, casting long, frantic shadows against the hills. I watched for an hour as the fire died down, leaving nothing but a smoldering charcoal scar in the middle of the ridge. I waited for the dawn, but the sun did not rise. The fog remained, dense and suffocating. As I turned to leave, I heard a sound from the bushes, a low, rhythmic scratching. I didn't turn around. I walked, straight and fast, away from the ridge, away from the mountain, away from the place where I'd left a part of my soul. I reached the valley by noon, but as I stood before the town lights, I caught my reflection in a shop window. For a split second, my eyes weren't brown. They were amber, swirling with sulfur, and I could hear a wet, rhythmic heartbeat thumping deep within my own chest. I wasn't just the witness anymore. I was the continuation. The forest had taken the cabin, but the skinwalker had taken the host. And now, I walk among you, wearing this skin, waiting for the moon to rise so I can go home to the hollows again. The audit of my humanity is closed. The creature is free.